Smithy is a 2021 Gothic horror novel by Amanda Desiree. Got this one from the library. Picked it up on a whim as I was looking through the horror stacks and thought, haven't heard of this one before. It looks interesting. Picked it up, brought it home, gave it a read. And I was rather impressed with it. I had originally planned to schedule this recommendation out into February since I already had some other recommendation videos completed, but then I remembered that the horror movie Primate was scheduled to come out in January, and I figured this would be a topical recommendation. I have not seen the movie as of this recording. Depending on when I end up scheduling the video, the movie may not even be in theaters yet, and I therefore cannot tell you whether or not it's worth a watch, only that I plan on seeing it when it's finally out. This book is done in kind of found footage format. Traditionally, you would refer to the book version of found footage stories as epistolary since it's being communicated through documents, but this definitely captures the vibe of found footage. The story is told to us through snippets of contemporary letters, video transcripts, diary entries, and then later articles and such about the incident. Essentially, the story centers around a group of researchers in 1974 and 1975. They've come to live in a somewhat dilapidated Newport mansion named Trevor Hall, which used to be a school, for the purposes of studying a chimpanzee named Webster, nicknamed Smithy. The goal is to prove that chimpanzees can learn to spontaneously communicate with humans if raised and educated to do so. As time goes on, strange things begin happening in Trevor Hall, and it becomes clear that Smithy might be seeing things that the researchers can't. His behavior progressively becomes more erratic, and finally something terrible happens towards the end of the book. So the first thing I need to say about this book is it's a slow burn. Smithy is over 500 pages long, and a lot of time is spent building up the basics of the experiment and all the characters in the first 200. Some tiny hints of supernatural involvement start to show up, and then progressively it becomes a bit more obvious going forward. I think it was around page 200 when we actually get some lore on Trevor Hall that corresponded with some of those hints we were given earlier on. For the remaining 300 pages, we get increasingly more obvious discussions about ghosts and paranormal activity. And because what we see is an accounting of events after the fact, sometimes the paranormal activity is on the subtler side. In fact, I'd argue that for most of the book, the paranormal activity is a pretty subtle representation. So this book is definitely a slow burn. Some people like that, some people might not. I would argue that this book pulls it off very well for what it's worth. Understanding the characters and what it is they're trying to accomplish with Smithy is important to understanding the things that happen later on, so I felt like the author dedicating time to developing those things before launching into the horror was a good choice. Your mileage may vary, though. It depends on what you want out of a horror story. I thought the writing was great, particularly within the context of being epistolary fiction. The number of times where I have read a book where it's written as someone's diary or like they're writing letters to someone, and the author just kind of forgets that they're writing a diary or somebody's letters and they start writing it the way they would write an ordinary novel. It happens all the time. I can kind of understand this if it's a character in an older setting, especially if it makes sense for the character to be a bit poetic or romantic in their writing. But there's a line between, all right, this is a person who just is very artistic in their writing. They write very flowery, poetic letters and diary entries. And okay, the author has forgotten that they are writing letters and diaries and to write the way a person in that day and time would write. And I would argue that Amanda Desiree did a great job at making sure that the diary entries, letters, and transcripts in this book were as realistic as possible. I could believe that these were actual documents written by actual people. The events they described were written in a way that I would expect an actual person to write them and not a novelist. The characters are interesting. Epistolary format is always a bit of fun when it comes to establishing characterization, especially if we see documents from multiple people, because one character may write a diary entry saying this is what happened, and then next we're reading a different character's perspective and they're saying that guy was full of it, this is actually what happened. It pushes you to question whether or not you're getting the full, unedited story from whoever is currently telling it. The author made use of that several times throughout the book, and I really enjoyed it. The setting was okay. Again, coming back to the fact that this is a story told through documents, we only know what the characters write down. So they're not necessarily going to be spending the entire book describing Trevor Hall in detail or noticing its features the way they might if we were reading this in one of the traditional narration types for second, third-person perspective. As I said, the author convincingly produces documents that read like real diaries and letters, but the sacrifice here is that she can't always afford to slip in details about Trevor Hall's appearance and atmosphere. So I really enjoyed Smithy, and I decided as the book was winding up that I should get a move on and order the 2024 sequel, Webster. I won't go into a crazy amount of detail because it will necessarily spoil the events of the first book. I will say that Smithy survives the events of the previous book and, with two of his caretakers, ends up in a secure facility to be experimented on. The sequel is very good for the first, 300 pages. We've had the entire previous book to set up the important players and the situation, so the author was a bit more straightforward about addressing the supernatural elements of the book. I would argue that in these first 300 pages, the supernatural elements were a lot stronger here than they were in the previous book. And the first 300 pages of Webster seemed to move a bit faster than Smithy did. But the remaining 300 pages, the book is like 600 pages long or so, the remaining 300 pages of the book, second half of the book, are dedicated to this court case involving Smithy. And it's around this point that the book kind of loses the plot a little. It loses the ghost aspect for a big chunk of it. It becomes very, very heavily focused on the court proceedings and loses a lot of the horror. In my opinion, I felt like this could have been cut down a bit in favor of keeping the horror element at the forefront. As presented, it ends up being shoved into the background. Webster also dedicates a lot of time to interrogating whether or not the supernatural elements of the first book and the first half of this one were real. In that respect, Webster was a great epistolary found footage horror book. It covers all the aspects of the case, including commentators and weirdos that gravitate to it, and in general treats it as though it were a real thing that really happened. I thought the book was very good in that respect, but it seemed to come at the cost of losing some of its horror appeal. There's a lot of commentary throughout the book about anthropomorphizing animals and the debate about how much a chimpanzee like Smithy might legitimately understand versus how much of it is the researchers projecting human attributes onto him. Webster delves more into how teaching Smithy sign language and raising him like a human for the formative years of his life was actually detrimental to him. He's not human, and he never will be, but now he also doesn't quite know how to be a chimpanzee. So he's kind of damned to be in this in-between space where he's too human to be a chimp, but too chimp to be human. Which I know is a debate that comes up a lot when it comes to the subject of people, taking in wild animals, raising wild animals, especially like exotic animals like chimpanzees, tigers. A big part of that conversation is the fact that once you've raised them to be a pet, they're kind of at a point where they can't really survive in the wilderness, so they can't be let go, but they also can't really stay as a pet because they're just too dangerous to have as pets. What was the case of, actually... Was it? Oh no, it wasn't Trevor. It was Travis the chimp. Yeah, he was the one, I think, back in 2009 that attacked that lady. The book concerns itself a lot with those kinds of discussions about whether or not it's a good idea to have chimps as pets, and should we be trying to elevate them above what they are, given that they are wild animals, because we're potentially damaging their ability to live in either world. It's an interesting conversation. I kind of enjoyed that part. So yeah, I recommend Smithy. I recommend Webster too, although you should be aware of what you're getting into. Gothic horror fans, I think, will be the best audience for Smithy. And if you enjoyed the Jordan Peele movie Nope, particularly for the B story about the chimpanzee, or if you're gunning to see the movie Primate, it's coming out, I think, on January 9th, you might enjoy Smithy and Webster as well. Also worth mentioning is that I think this is probably a good series for someone to get into if they're looking for horror that is not super scary. Like if you're someone who's maybe a little easily rattled, you're not a fan of reading like the more intense horror books, you might like this series because it's got its spooky elements, it's got its scary elements, but it's not terrifying. It's not probably going to scare you the way that some other horror books would. So I definitely recommend this for beginning horror readers who are a little nervous about picking up the genre.